In the harsh aftermath of the Civil War, a haunted former soldier wanders the New Mexico desert, carrying nothing but regrets and a loaded revolver. When he witnesses a young Native American woman being sold in a dusty cantina, one impulsive act of compassion sends them both on a dangerous journey of redemption. As they flee toward the mountains with a ruthless mining company in pursuit, two broken souls begin to heal each other in ways neither could imagine. If you love stories of redemption in the Wild West, hit that like button, subscribe for new chapters every week, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The New Mexico desert stretched before James Blackwood like an ocean of golden agony, its vastness a mirror to the emptiness within. The unforgiving sun that beat down upon his weathered face felt almost welcome, a fair penance for sins carried too long. His horse, a dappled grey, as tired and worn as its master, trudged forward with the same resigned determination that had characterized their journey for weeks, months, perhaps years. Time had ceased to hold meaning for James after Shiloh. The war had ended for the nation, but never for him. In quiet moments, cannon fire still reverberated through his consciousness. In dreams, the screams of dying men, boys really, still pierced the night. James had survived, but parts of him remained buried in shallow graves across battlefields, whose names he sometimes struggled to remember. Silver Creek appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a collection of weather-beaten structures clinging to existence in defiance of the desert's indifference. From a distance, it almost resembled salvation. James knew better. Towns like these held no redemption, only temporary shelter from the elements, and if luck permitted, a whiskey strong enough to silence memory for a night. His boots left imprints in the dust as he led his horse down what passed for Silver Creek's main street. Eyes followed him, wary, calculating, measuring his threat. The familiar weight of his revolver hung at his hip, an extension of himself. He wished he could discard, but couldn't imagine surviving without. The calluses on his trigger finger had long ago become permanent ridges in his skin, marking him as surely as any brand. The air smelled of desperation and decay. Silver Creek was dying, its silver depleted, its purpose fading. James recognized the scent of a place running out of reasons to exist. It matched the aroma that had followed him for years. He paused outside a cantina whose sign had long ago surrendered its lettering to the elements. The shadows within promised a moment's respite from the sun, perhaps water for his parched throat. Nothing more. James had abandoned hope for anything more. As he tethered his horse, his eyes caught a flash of movement, a small bird, bright against the dull backdrop of the town, darting between buildings. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving James to wonder if his mind had conjured it from heat and exhaustion. But something about its flight stirred a long dormant feeling within his chest, something almost like curiosity. With one hand resting on his revolver, a habit born of necessity rather than intention, James pushed open the cantina door and stepped from blinding light into concealing darkness, unaware that fate awaited him inside, wearing chains and carrying the possibility of his salvation. The cantina's interior revealed itself gradually to James's sun-dazzled eyes, a purgatory of smoke, stale breath, and barely contained violence. Men hunched over tables like vultures guarding carrion, their conversations dropping to suspicious murmurs as he entered. The floorboards protested beneath his boots, announcing his presence to those whose backs faced the door. He made his way to the bar, avoiding eye contact, but missing nothing. Years of survival had taught him to perceive everything while appearing to notice nothing. The barman, a mountain of flesh with dead eyes, acknowledged him with the barest nod, sliding a glass of amber liquid without being asked. It was then that James saw her. In the cantina's farthest corner, a young woman stood with her wrists bound before her. Her black hair fell in a tangled curtain, partially obscuring a face whose pride remained intact despite the circumstances. She wore a simple dress, torn at the shoulder, and her feet were bare against the filthy floor. But it was her eyes that caught James, fierce, unbroken, alive with a fire he'd thought extinguished in all living things. "Genuine Apache stock," a man's voice announced, cutting through the tavern's murmur. "Young enough to train up proper, strong enough for work." The speaker, a corpulent figure whose expensive suit seemed to barely contain his flesh, circled the woman like she was livestock. "Auction starts at $20. The cantina patrons stirred, interest kindling in their dull eyes. James recognized the expressions, men contemplating ownership of something they could never truly possess. The woman's gaze remained fixed on a point beyond the room, as if refusing to acknowledge the reality of her situation. "Half-breed," someone called out. "Look at them features, half white, ain't she? Makes her more valuable," the auctioneer countered smoothly. "Beauty of both worlds, gentility of neither. 25, do I hear 25? James's hand tightened around his glass. The familiar numbness that had been his constant companion began to recede, replaced by a sensation he'd thought long dead. Rage. Not the hot, explosive anger of youth, but something colder, deeper, more dangerous. In his mind, unbidden, came the image of another woman years earlier, her brown skin marked with the lash, her eyes holding the same distant focus as she was paraded before buyers. He'd been younger then, wearing a uniform that had once held meaning. He'd stood frozen, watching, saying nothing, doing nothing. $50, James heard himself say, his voice rusty with disuse. The room went silent. The auctioneer turned, assessing James with new interest. "Well now," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "A gentleman with taste, $50 from the stranger." No other bids followed. Perhaps it was the look in James's eyes. Perhaps it was the way his hand never strayed far from his weapon. Whatever the reason, minutes later he found himself outside the cantina, leading his horse with one hand, while the woman, Nayeli, the auctioneer had called her, walked beside him, her bound wrists the only visible sign of her captivity. James had purchased her freedom, not her person. But as Silver Creek watched them with suspicious eyes, he wondered if she understood the difference, or if such distinctions mattered at all in a world that reduced humans to property. They left Silver Creek as the afternoon sun began its reluctant descent, painting the desert in hues of copper and blood. James had cut Nayeli's bonds immediately after they'd cleared the cantina's sightlines, offering her his canteen without a word. She'd accepted with equal silence, her eyes never leaving his face, searching for the intention behind the gesture. Now they walked side by side, the horse between them like a buffer against conversation. James had no plan beyond putting distance between them and the town. Each step carried them further from Silver Creek, but closer to the question that hung between them, unspoken but demanding answer. What now? The desert received them with indifferent majesty, sprawling mesas standing sentinel against the horizon, yucca plants raising their pale blossoms like offerings to an unforgiving sky. James felt Nayeli's eyes on him occasionally, cautious assessments followed by longer periods of studied avoidance. "You may leave whenever you wish," he finally said, his voice startling against the backdrop of wind and distant coyote calls. "I claim no ownership." Nayeli's response came after a long pause, her English carrying the rhythmic cadence of her native tongue. "Where would I go? My mother's people do not claim me. My father's people sold me." The bitterness in her voice was a tangible thing, sharp as desert thorns. James nodded, understanding more than she perhaps intended to reveal. Belonging nowhere was a condition he recognized intimately. "North?" he said after a while. "I'm heading north, beyond territorial boundaries, where companies and governments hold less sway." He glanced at her. "You can accompany me that far." A sound that might have been a laugh escaped her. "You speak as if I have choice." "You do," James replied, the words emerging with unexpected force. "Always." Something shifted in her. Expression then, not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first seedling of possibility. She reached up to touch a small leather pouch that hung from a cord around her neck, her fingers tracing its outline in what appeared to be an unconscious gesture. They continued in silence as the landscape transformed around them, shadows lengthening into purple fingers that stretched across the sand. The day's heat began to surrender to evening's chill, that peculiar desert contradiction that had claimed the lives of many unprepared travelers. James guided them toward a shallow arroyo where they might make camp, sheltered from wind and hidden from casual observation. As they descended into the natural depression, Nayeli suddenly froze, her body tensing like a deer, sensing predators. "Someone follows," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the horizon behind them. James turned, hand instinctively moving to his revolver. He saw nothing but the empty trail they'd left, yet something in her certainty gave him pause. The desert held secrets invisible to those not born to its mysteries. "How do you know?" he asked, not doubting but seeking understanding. Nayeli's eyes met his directly for the first time. "The birds," she said simply, "they rise and settle, rise and settle. Someone disturbs their pattern behind us." James nodded, accepting her knowledge without question. "Then we'll be cautious," he said, and ready. As they prepared their sparse camp, the unspoken awareness of pursuit bound them together more surely than any shared history could have. Danger, James reflected, as he gathered brush for a small, smokeless fire, had always been the most efficient architect of alliance. Darkness descended upon the desert like a held breath finally released, bringing with it a profound silence that seemed to amplify every small sound, the soft shifting of sand beneath their blankets, the occasional stamp of the horse's hoof, the whisper of wind through scrub brush. Above them, stars emerged with startling clarity, countless and cold, in their distant observation of human concerns. James sat with his back against a boulder, revolver resting across his lap. He'd insisted Nayeli take what meager comfort their campsite offered, a thin blanket spread over the softest patch of ground within the arroyo's protection. She had accepted with wary gratitude, curling onto her side with her back to him, though he doubted she slept. The night air carried the lingering scent of the coffee he'd brewed earlier, bitter and grounding. They had shared a meal of jerky and hardtack in silence, the absence of words between them not exactly comfortable, but not hostile either. A neutral territory where both could exist without commitment to whatever might come next. "Why did you buy me?" Nayeli's question cut through the darkness without preamble, her voice low but clear. James considered the query, knowing instinctively that his answer would set the tone for whatever relationship might develop between them. He could offer platitudes about decency or righteousness, but suspected she would recognize such posturing for what it was. "I watched someone sold once," he said finally. "Did nothing. Couldn't live with seeing it again." He heard her shift slightly, perhaps turning to study his silhouette against the star-filled sky. "So I am your redemption." The question held no accusation, only a weary understanding. "No," James replied. "No one can provide that for another. I just couldn't add another sin to my collection." A sound escaped her. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "And what will you do with me now that your conscience is clear?" "Nothing," he said. "You're not mine to do anything with." Silence stretched between them again, this one heavier with unspoken thoughts. The distant howl of a coyote mourned, something lost or never found. "They will come for me," Nayeli said eventually. "The mining company, their man, Thornton, he believes I belong to him, that I have value beyond myself. James nodded in the darkness, though she couldn't see the gesture. Why? Her hesitation was palpable. My father was a surveyor for them. He knew things, wrote things. Before he died. Her hand moved to the leather pouch at her neck. They think I have what they seek. Do you? Perhaps. The word hung between them, an offering of trust so tentative it might dissolve in the desert air. But some knowledge should remain buried. James didn't press further. Secrets were currency in a world that stripped people of everything else. He would not demand she spend hers rashly. Sleep, he said. I'll keep watch. To his surprise, she seemed to accept this assurance. Her breathing gradually slowed, deepened. James remained vigilant, eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small haven, thoughts turning to the path ahead. North meant mountains eventually, different dangers, different hiding places. If pursuit came, when it came, they would need every advantage. As the night deepened toward its coldest hours, James noticed Nayeli shivering despite the blanket. After a moment's hesitation, he removed his worn coat and gently laid it over her sleeping form. The gesture felt foreign to hands more accustomed to violence than kindness, yet something in the simple act eased a tightness in his chest he hadn't recognized was there. In the distance, a shooting star traced a brief, brilliant path across the heavens before disappearing. James watched its passage with an odd sense of kinship, wondering if Nayeli's presence in his life would prove equally transient, a momentary illumination before returning to darkness. Morning arrived with the soft lavender light that precedes. True dawn, diffusing across the desert floor and transforming ordinary rocks and cacti into sentinels of some ancient, forgotten kingdom. James had allowed himself only brief intervals of shallow sleep during the night, his body trained by years of necessity to remain partially alert, even in rest. He found Nayeli already awake, sitting cross-legged at the arroyo's edge, her face turned toward the lightening eastern sky. His coat lay neatly folded beside her. She acknowledged his approach with a slight inclination of her head, but didn't speak, seeming to understand his preference for silence in these early hours. They broke camp efficiently, each attending to tasks with minimal discussion. A partnership of circumstance rather than choice, but functioning nonetheless. As James saddled the horse, Nayeli gathered the few wild edibles she'd found, growing among the rocks, tucking them into a small bundle fashioned from a spare bandana. There, she said suddenly, pointing toward a distant rise where the land buckled upward in a gentle slope. To James's eye, it appeared no different from countless other undulations in the terrain, but he had learned to trust her perception. Dust. James squinted against the strengthening light. After a moment he detected it, a faint disturbance in the air, the barest suggestion of Earth being displaced by movement. Too regular for wind, too persistent for wildlife. How many? He asked, already calculating distances and options. Nayeli studied the horizon. 3 riders, moving fast. A muscle tightened in James's jaw. 3 meant a coordinated search, not a random pursuit. 3 meant Thornton had resources and determination. 3 meant the distance between Silver Creek and safety had just lengthened considerably. We need to move, he said, securing the last of their meager supplies. The arroyo continues northwest. It'll provide cover for a few miles. Nayeli nodded, but her expression had grown distant, her thoughts clearly turning inward. Her fingers found the leather pouch at her neck. An unconscious gesture that James had noticed occurred whenever she felt threatened. "What's in there?" he asked as they began walking, leading the horse between them. Her eyes flicked to his face, assessing his intent. "My mother's medicine," she answered finally, "and my father's sin." It wasn't a complete answer, but James recognized it as more truth than she'd likely offered anyone in a long time. He nodded, accepting the boundary she'd set. They traveled in tense silence, the arroyo's walls providing illusory protection that nonetheless allowed them to move without constant vigilance. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying by degrees until the air shimmered with it, distorting distant horizons into wavering mirages. Near midday, when even their determined pace had slowed under the sun's assault, James spotted a small overhang of rock that promised shade. Without discussion, they diverted toward it, both recognizing the folly of pushing through the worst of the day's heat. In the relative coolness beneath the stone, they rationed water and shared a small portion of their food. James noticed Nayeli's gaze repeatedly drifting to the leather pouch, her expression troubled. "Thornton," he said, breaking their silence. "Tell me about him." Nayeli's eyes darkened. "A man who believes everything has a price." She took a small sip of water. "My father worked for him, mapping areas for the mining company. My father was weak. He drank, gambled." Her voice remained steady, but contempt shadowed her words. "He owed Thornton money. When he couldn't pay, Thornton said he would take me. Instead," James felt the cold weight of familiar rage settle in his stomach. "Your father agreed." "My father died before the debt could be collected," she said. "Some say by his own hand, others say Thornton grew impatient." Her fingers traced patterns in the dust. "I ran, lived with my mother's people for a time, but—" She shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its resignation. "A half-blood belongs nowhere. When hunger came, I left rather than burden them. That's when Thornton's men found me." James absorbed her story, recognizing the spaces between words where deeper truths lay buried. Whatever was in that pouch, it was valuable enough for Thornton to pursue a debt well beyond its original worth. "We'll reach the mountains in 2 days if we push," he said, offering strategy in place of sympathy he didn't know how to express. "More places to disappear there." Nayeli met his gaze directly. "Why are you helping me? Truly?" The question hung between them, demanding a more honest answer than he'd given in the darkness the night before. James looked away, studying the heat-blurred landscape beyond their shelter. "Because I've been running too," he said finally, "and no one should have to run alone." By late afternoon, the arroyo had widened and deepened, transforming from mere depression to significant channel. Though dry now, the smooth stones lining its bottom testified to the power of water that occasionally raged through this passageway. James and Nayeli walked in its shelter, grateful for the shade provided by its increasingly steep walls, aware that the same feature that protected them also limited their ability to detect pursuit. The sound reached them before they saw its source, a whisper at first, then a steadier murmur that gradually resolved into the unmistakable voice of moving water. As they rounded a bend in the arroyo, they discovered where it ended, opening suddenly into a small canyon where a narrow river flowed between rocky banks. James felt his spirits lift at the sight. Water meant life, possibilities, choices that the desert had seemed determined to deny them. Beside him, Nayeli's shoulders relaxed minutely, her first visible surrender to relief since they'd begun their journey. "It's the Gallegos," she said, recognition softening her features. "My mother's people called it Spirit's Path." They approached the riverbank cautiously. The water ran clear and swift, its surface dappled with late afternoon light, filtering through cottonwoods that clustered along its course. Not wide, perhaps 20 feet across at its broadest point, but deep enough at the center to require swimming. "We'll cross," James decided, surveying the terrain. "Put the river between us and Thornton's men. They'll need to find a ford for their horses, which will cost them time." Nayeli nodded, but hesitation crossed her face as she studied the flowing water. "I cannot swim," she admitted, the words seeming to cost her something in pride. James considered this, then glanced at his horse. "Hold the saddle. He'll carry you across." They set about preparing for the crossing. James removed his boots, securing them to the saddle along with their provisions. Nayeli did the same with her few possessions, though she kept the leather pouch firmly around her neck. The ritual of preparation carried its own tension, both aware that the river crossing would leave them vulnerable, both conscious that any misstep could cost them dearly. "If anything happens," James said as he finished checking the horse's cinch, "keep heading north. 3 days' travel will bring you to Larson's trading post. Man who runs it owes me a favor." Nayeli studied him, her dark eyes unreadable. "You speak as though you expect to die." "I expect nothing," James replied. "I prepare for everything." A faint smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen. It transformed her face, revealing a glimpse of the woman she might have been in a different life, under different circumstances. "A wise approach," she conceded. James led the horse into the shallows, feeling the cold shock of water against his skin. The current tugged at his legs with gentle insistence, a reminder of forces that could not be reasoned with or threatened into submission. Nayeli followed, her hand gripping the saddle horn, her expression determined despite her fear. They were, halfway across, the water chest-deep on James and the horse swimming strongly, when Nayeli's free hand suddenly flew to her neck. The leather pouch had slipped free, caught by the current. Without thinking, she released the saddle to grab for it. "Nayeli!" James lunged for her as the current immediately swept her downstream. What followed was a chaos of churning water, desperate grasping, and the horse's nervous whinnying. James caught her arm, pulled her against him, fighting the river's claim with every ounce of strength he possessed. For an instant that stretched into eternity, he feared the water would win. Then his foot found purchase on a submerged rock, and he managed to propel them both toward the far bank. They collapsed on the shore, gasping, water streaming from their clothes. The horse had made it across and stood nearby, shaking itself like a massive dog. Nayeli clutched the leather pouch against her chest, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. Once he had caught his breath, James turned to her. "What's in there that's worth dying for?" Nayeli met his gaze, something new in her expression. Trust mingled with defiance. Slowly, she opened the pouch and withdrew a folded paper, water-stained but still intact. She handed it to him wordlessly. James unfolded it carefully. It was a map, detailed and precise, marked with annotations in a cramped hand. Even with his limited knowledge of such things, he recognized what he was looking at, the location of a significant silver deposit, undiscovered and unclaimed. "This is what Thornton wants," he said, understanding dawning. "This could make a man rich, or destroy what remains of my mother's people," Nayeli replied quietly. "The land marked there is sacred to them, a place of healing waters and ancient spirits." James refolded the map, feeling its weight not just in his hands, but in his conscience. He returned it to her with a nod that acknowledged both her trust and the burden she carried. As they gathered themselves to continue their journey, James noticed something on the riverbank catching the light, a perfect stone, polished smooth by water and time. On impulse, he picked it up and offered it to Nayeli. "For your pouch," he said awkwardly, "to replace what water nearly took." She accepted the stone, turning it in her fingers before carefully placing it alongside the map in her pouch. No words passed between them regarding the gesture, but something shifted nevertheless, a current deeper than the river's changing its course within them both. The landscape began to change subtly as they moved northward, the desert gradually, surrendering to scattered pines and junipers that stood like green sentinels against the endless sky. They made camp that night in a small depression ringed by stunted trees, their branches offering concealment if not comfort. The elevated terrain provided clear sightlines to the river they had crossed, now a silver ribbon in the distance. No sign of pursuit had manifested since the crossing, but neither James nor Nayeli allowed themselves to relax their vigilance. They built only the smallest of fires, using dry pine needles and twigs that produced minimal smoke. The flames cast flickering shadows across their faces as they ate a spare meal of jerky, supplemented by wild onions Nayeli had gathered. "Tell me about the war," Nayeli said suddenly, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled between them. "The one that haunts your sleep." James looked up, startled. He hadn't realized his nightmares had been visible, had thought his demons remained his alone. But her gaze held no judgment, only a quiet recognition of suffering she somehow understood. "It was—" He paused, searching for words adequate to describe the indescribable. Men killing men for reasons that seemed to matter less with each death. "You fought for the North," she said, not a question. James nodded. Believed in the cause at first. Freedom. Equality. A bitter smile twisted his lips. Pretty words that lost their meaning in the mud and blood. The fire crackled, between them sparks ascending like brief doomed stars. "What changed you?" Nayeli asked, her voice gentle yet persistent. James stared into the flames, seeing not their camp, but a different fire, a different time. "Shiloh," he said finally. 2 days of hell that ended with nothing resolved. I walked through a field where the dead and dying lay so thick you couldn't take a step without touching someone's body. He swallowed hard. Had to make choices about who to help, who to leave. Played at being God. Nayeli's expression reflected understanding beyond her years. "And that is why you could not walk away in Silver Creek." "Perhaps." James poked at the fire with a stick, watching embers flare and fade. "Or perhaps I'm still trying to balance scales that can never be balanced." They sat in silence for a time, each absorbed in private thoughts. Above them, stars emerged in their thousands, indifferent to human suffering, yet somehow comforting in their constancy. "My mother was a healer," Nayeli said eventually, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that suggested storytelling was sacred in her culture. She could find the plant, the root, the flower that would draw poison from a wound or ease a laboring woman's pain. "When she met my father, she believed his words of love were true medicine." Her fingers traced the outline of the pouch at her neck. "He gave her this, said it represented his heart, given into her keeping." James watched her face in the firelight, seeing the complex emotions that played across her features. Love, disappointment, acceptance. She never stopped believing in him, even when the mining company came and he changed, even when the whiskey became his god. Nayeli's gaze lifted to the stars. When he died, she placed his map in this pouch alongside her medicines. Said his final act was trying to protect something precious. A sad smile touched her lips. "I think she needed to believe that." "And you?" James asked. "What do you believe?" Nayeli considered the question. "I believe that all paths eventually lead where they must, like water finding its way to the sea." She looked at him directly. "Even yours, James Blackwood." The sound of his full name startled him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard it spoken aloud. He'd been simply Blackwood during the war, and afterward, names had seemed unnecessary baggage for a man trying to outrun his past. "How did you know?" he asked. "It's stitched inside your coat," she said. "I saw it when you covered me last night." A simple explanation, yet it left James feeling unexpectedly exposed, as if she'd glimpsed something more intimate than a name sewn into fabric. The sensation wasn't entirely unpleasant. They talked long into the night, an exchange of stories like trading precious gems, each offering carefully chosen, each acceptance a small act of trust. James spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, of a father who taught him both to read Milton and to shoot straight. Nayeli described summers with her mother's people, learning to read the desert's subtle language of survival. Neither spoke of the future or what might await them beyond the next rise, the next challenge. Yet as the fire burned down to embers and silence again claimed its place between them, something had irrevocably changed. Two solitary paths had begun to intertwine, creating a new trail neither could have foreseen. They continued northward, as dawn painted the eastern sky with delicate strokes of pink and gold. The air carried a different scent now, pine resin and sage, the mineral tang of distant mountains. James noted how Nayeli's stride had lengthened, her gaze lifting more. Frequently to the horizon, small signs of hope taking root. By midday, the character of the sky had changed. Clouds gathered in towering formations to the west, their undersides darkening with ominous intent. The wind strengthened, carrying the unmistakable smell of approaching rain. James studied the heavens with growing concern. "We need shelter," he said, scanning their surroundings. "Desert storms come fast and hit hard." Nayeli nodded, her expression grave. "There." She pointed to a formation of weathered rock jutting from a hillside perhaps half a mile distant. "Caves, if memory serves." They quickened their pace, the horse growing skittish as thunder rumbled in the distance. The temperature dropped precipitously, the air charged with electricity that raised the hair on James's arms. He'd seen storms like this swallow men whole, turn dry arroyos into raging torrents within minutes. They reached the rock formation just as the first heavy drops began to fall. As Nayeli had promised, a shallow cave penetrated the hillside, its entrance partially obscured by brush. James led the nervous horse inside, Nayeli following close behind. No sooner had they entered than the sky seemed to tear open, releasing a deluge that transformed the landscape into a chaotic blur. The cave provided adequate shelter, dry, deep enough to accommodate them and the horse, with sufficient clearance to stand upright. James set about making a small fire near the entrance where the smoke could escape. Nayeli arranged their belongings, creating a semblance of order in the temporary refuge. "Could be worse," James commented as he coaxed flames from tinder. "Storm might wipe out our tracks." Nayeli didn't respond immediately. When James glanced up, he found her staring at the cave walls, her expression one of reverent recognition. "What is it?" he asked. "This place." She moved closer to the wall, her fingers hovering over faded markings that James now noticed covered much of the stone surface. "My mother's people left these. Stories painted in earth and blood." James stood, moving beside her to examine the markings. Even to his untrained eye, they clearly depicted human figures, animals, celestial bodies, a visual language recording events deemed worthy of permanence. "What do they say?" he asked softly. Nayeli traced a particular image, a spiral surrounded by handprints. "This tells of a great journey undertaken when drought forced the people to seek new lands." Her finger moved to another figure, a being partly human, partly bird. "This is Grandfather Hawk, who guided them through darkness to water." She continued around the cave, translating fragments of a history preserved in pigment and stone. James watched her, struck by the transformation in her demeanor. Here, surrounded by her cultural heritage, Nayeli seemed to shed layers of caution, her movements becoming fluid, her voice taking on the cadence of practiced storytelling. This was her true self, he realized. Not the guarded woman who had walked beside him through the desert, but this animated interpreter of memory and meaning. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury. Water cascaded past the cave entrance, like a transparent curtain, occasional lightning illuminating the chamber in stark, brief moments of perfect clarity. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very stone around them. "My father used to fear storms," Nayeli said, returning to sit near the fire. "Said they were the gods arguing." A small smile played at her lips. "My mother told him it was Just the sky, cleaning itself, making room for new light. James settled across from her, the fire between them casting wavering shadows across the ancient art surrounding them. "And what do you believe?" he asked, echoing her question from the night before. Nayeli considered, her face serious in the flickering light. "I believe that which appears most destructive sometimes clears the path for what must grow." Her eyes met his. Like fire that burns the forest, but allows new seeds to open. The metaphor wasn't lost on James. He'd seen too much of fire's indiscriminate destruction to romanticize its consequences, yet he understood the truth in her words. His own life had been burned to ash by war, yet here he sat, something new and unexpected taking tentative root within him. A particularly violent thunderclap shook dust from the cave ceiling, causing the horse to stamp nervously. James moved, to calm the animal, stroking its neck and murmuring reassurances. "You have gentle hands," Nayeli observed quietly, "for a man who has known so much violence." James looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, instruments that had dealt death and now offered comfort. The contradiction had never struck him quite so forcefully before. "Perhaps we are all more than our worst actions," he said, the words emerging unbidden. "Or our worst circumstances," Nayeli added softly. A comfortable silence settled between them as the storm continued its assault on the world outside. In this moment of enforced pause, this shelter carved from stone and time, James felt something shift within him, not a dramatic transformation, but the subtle rearrangement of possibilities, like a river changing course by inches rather than miles. When Nayeli eventually slept, curled near the fire with his coat once again serving as her blanket, James remained awake, listening to the storm's gradual retreat and watching shadows dance across ancient stories etched in stone. For the first time in years, the future seemed not a burden to be endured, but a path that might, against all odds, lead somewhere worth reaching. The storm departed as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Washes that had been bone dry now carried swift currents of muddy water. Desert flora glistened with droplets that captured sunlight like thousands of tiny prisms. The air smelled of wet earth and renewal. James and Nayeli emerged from the cave into this refreshed world, both tacitly acknowledging that the storm had altered more than just their surroundings. Something had changed between them, a tentative trust taking root, fragile yet persistent as the desert flowers that would soon bloom in response to the rainfall. They traveled with new purpose, following game trails that wound gradually upward toward the distant mountains. The terrain grew increasingly varied, rocky outcroppings, stands of juniper and pinyon pine, occasional meadows where wildflowers had already begun to respond to the recent moisture. With each mile northward, James felt the desert's grip loosening, though its lessons remained. Near midday, as they paused to rest in the shade of a towering rock formation, Nayeli suddenly stiffened, her head turning sharply toward the path they had traveled. "What is it?" James asked, hand instinctively moving to his revolver. "Horses," she replied, voice low. 3 or 4, coming fast." James listened, but heard nothing beyond the soft sigh of wind through pine needles. Yet he didn't doubt her. Her senses had proven more attuned to the landscape than his own. "How far?" "Less than an hour behind us." Her expression hardened. "Thornton." James quickly assessed their options. The storm had granted them time, but had also made their trail easier to follow in the softened earth. They could attempt to outpace their pursuers, but that strategy held little promise with their single, already tired horse. "We need to choose the ground," he decided, scanning the surrounding terrain. His eyes settled on a narrow pass between 2 rocky slopes ahead. "There!" They moved with renewed urgency, no longer bothering to conceal their trail. If confrontation was inevitable, better to shape its circumstances than be overtaken in open country. James felt the familiar cold focus descending upon him, the clarity that had kept him alive through countless skirmishes and ambushes during the war. The pass provided the advantage he sought, a natural bottleneck where superior numbers would matter less, with abundant cover in the form of boulders and scrub pine. After securing their horse in a protected hollow, James and Nayeli positioned themselves behind a tumble of rocks that overlooked the approach. "You don't have to be part of this," James told her, checking his revolver with practiced movements. "Take the horse, continue north while I delay them." Nayeli's expression hardened with resolve. "My burden brought them. I will not abandon you to face it alone." From within her dress, she produced a small knife, crude but serviceable. "I am not without defenses." James wanted to protest, but recognized the futility. Instead, he nodded, once respecting her choice. "Stay low, use cover. If things go badly, don't hesitate to run." They settled into tents, waiting, the sun climbing toward its zenith as minutes stretched into a half-hour, then longer. James began to wonder if Nayeli's warning had been mistaken. Then he heard it too, the distant rhythm of hoofbeats approaching, at a measured pace. "Remember," James murmured, "Thornton is the head. Cut it off, and the body falls." 4 riders appeared at the pass entrance, moving in careful formation. 3 wore the dust-covered clothing of hired guns, men whose loyalty extended precisely as far as their payment. The 4th, riding slightly ahead, presented a stark contrast, immaculately dressed despite the terrain, his black coat and wide-brimmed hat unmarked by travel. Even at a distance, James could discern the man's imperious bearing. Thornton, without question. The party halted just before the narrowest section of the pass. Thornton raised a hand, signaling caution. His cold gaze surveyed the rocky slopes with the calculation of a predator assessing potential threats. "Blackwood," he called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "I know you're there. Let's discuss this as businessmen." James remained silent, watching as the hired guns spread out slightly, hands near their weapons. "I have no quarrel with you," Thornton continued. "It's the girl and what she carries that interest me. Turn her over, and you can ride away with compensation for your trouble." Beside him, James felt Nayeli tense. He placed a steadying hand on her arm, a silent request for patience. "Hiding behind rocks doesn't become a war veteran," Thornton called, his tone sharpening with impatience. "The Apache whore isn't worth dying for." The slur sparked something in James, not the hot rage of youth, but something colder, more focused. He stood, exposing himself just enough to be seen while keeping partial cover. "She's not for sale," he replied, voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men in battle. "Neither is what she protects." Thornton's expression shifted from confidence to calculation. "Every man has his price, Blackwood. Name yours." "You couldn't afford it," James answered simply. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft nickering of nervous horses. James could almost see the thoughts racing behind Thornton's eyes, assessing risks, calculating odds, weighing potential losses against desired gains. "Very well," Thornton said finally, a thin smile spreading across his face. "I tried civility." He turned to his men. "Kill him. Bring me the girl and her pouch." What followed unfolded with the terrible clarity of violence. Gunshots shattering the afternoon quiet, the acrid smell of powder smoke, men shouting and horses screaming. James fired with precision born of grim experience, each shot deliberate, each consequence accepted as necessary. 2 of Thornton's men fell before they properly registered the threat. The 3rd managed to wound James, a bullet grazing his shoulder in a line of fire that momentarily blinded him with pain. Through the haze, he saw Thornton wheeling his horse, attempting to flee now that the odds had turned. "He's running!" Nayeli cried, already moving to intercept. "Nayeli, wait!" James called. but she had darted from cover, scrambling down the rocky slope with surprising speed. Thornton saw her coming and drew a small pistol from inside his coat. Time seemed to slow as James took aim, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest as he steadied his revolver. He fired a single shot. Thornton jerked in his saddle, the pistol tumbling from his grasp unfired. For a moment, he remained upright, a look of genuine surprise crossing his features. Then he slumped forward and fell heavily to the ground. The silence that followed seemed absolute, as if the very landscape held its breath in the aftermath of violence. James made his way carefully down to where Nayeli stood over Thornton's body, her expression unreadable. "Is he dead?" she asked without looking up. James checked briefly. "Yes." Nayeli nodded once, then knelt beside the body. With deliberate movements, she removed a silver watch from Thornton's vest pocket and held it up, examining the ornate engravings that decorated its case. "My father's," she said simply, "taken as collateral for his debts." She pocketed the watch, then rose and finally looked at James, her eyes widening as she noticed the blood staining his shirt. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he said, though the wound burned with increasing intensity. "We should move. Gunfire carries in these hills." They collected what supplies they could salvage from Thornton's party: ammunition, food, canteens. James hesitated over the bodies, old habits urging him to bury the dead, but pragmatism prevailed. The desert would claim them soon enough. As they prepared to continue their journey, Nayeli placed a hand on James's arm, stopping him. "You killed for me today," she said, her voice solemn. "I will not forget." "I killed to protect what matters," James corrected gently. "There's a difference." Something shifted in her expression then, a softening, a recognition. "Yes," she agreed, "there is." They traveled until nightfall, pushing harder than was wise, but driven by the need for distance between themselves and the scene at the pass. The terrain continued its gradual ascent, the desert giving way more decisively to foothills where stands of ponderosa pine created deeper shadows, and the air carried the scent of resin and wild herbs. James's wound, dismissed initially as minor, had worsened throughout the afternoon. The bullet had only grazed his shoulder, but desert dust and exertion had transformed the injury into a throbbing source of heat and pain that radiated through his upper body. He hid his discomfort as best he could, unwilling to become a burden when safety remained uncertain. When they finally made camp in a sheltered hollow beside a small spring, Nayeli insisted on examining the wound. Her expression grew serious as she gently pulled away the blood-stiffened fabric of his shirt. "This needs tending," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Sit." James complied, lowering himself onto a flat rock as Nayeli gathered water from the spring in their small cooking pot. She worked methodically, heating the water over their modest fire, then tearing strips from a spare bandana to create rudimentary bandages. "My mother taught me healing," she explained, as she carefully cleaned the wound, her touch gentle despite the pain her ministrations caused. "Different plants for different purposes. Some to stop bleeding, some to draw out poison, some to ease pain." James watched her work, struck by the quiet confidence in her movements. This was yet another facet of Nayeli revealed: the healer, alongside the survivor, the storyteller, the keeper of sacred trust. "There," she said, examining a particular plant growing near the spring's edge. "Fortune smiles upon us." She harvested several leaves, crushing them between smooth stones, before applying the resulting paste to James's wound. The effect was immediate, a cooling sensation that seemed to draw the heat from the injury, dulling the sharp edges of pain. "What is it?" James asked, genuinely curious. "My people call it ghost flower," Nayeli replied as she carefully bandaged his shoulder. It grows where water meets stone, always in shadow. The spirits placed it there for those who walk difficult paths. James smiled faintly. Convenient belief. All true beliefs are convenient in their time, she countered, securing the bandage with a firm knot. That doesn't make them less true. The wound dressed. They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, supplemented by tender pine nuts. Nayeli had gathered during their brief rest stops throughout the day. The fire burned low, conserving their limited supply of dry wood while still providing necessary warmth as the mountain air cooled rapidly with nightfall. "How far to Apache territory?" James asked, as they sat side by side, watching shadows dance across the surrounding trees. 2 days, perhaps 3, Nayeli answered. "There is a permanent camp in the high valley beyond these foothills." She glanced at him. "They will not welcome you easily." "Few do," James replied without self-pity. Nayeli studied him in the firelight. "You have fever coming," she observed. "The plant will help, but rest is needed." James nodded, acknowledging what he'd felt building within his body, the familiar heat of infection taking hold. "I'll take first watch," he insisted. "Wake you in a few hours." She looked as if she might argue, but instead nodded reluctantly. "Call me if the heat grows worse." Despite his intention to remain vigilant, James found himself drifting, consciousness slipping away in fragments as fever gradually claimed its territory. Dreams came, confused images of battlefields overlaid with desert landscapes, faceless, soldiers transformed into Thornton's men, all punctuated by the report of rifles and the screams of the dying. He awakened with a start to find Nayeli kneeling beside him, her palm cool against his forehead. Night had deepened around them. The fire had burned down to glowing embers that cast just enough light to illuminate her concerned expression. "You're burning," she said softly. "The wound speaks with fever's voice." James tried to sit up, but weakness pressed him back against the ground. "How long?" he managed. "Hours," Nayeli replied. "You called out in your sleep. Names, places, apologies." Embarrassment flooded through him at the thought of his private demons exposed, but Nayeli's expression held no judgment. "The past walks with us always," she said, helping him drink from their canteen. "In fever its footsteps grow louder." She refreshed the herbal paste on his wound and made him drink a bitter tea brewed from different plants gathered near their camp. Throughout the night, she tended him with quiet determination, cooling his forehead with damp cloth when the fever peaked, supporting him when chills racked his frame, speaking soft words in her native tongue that sounded like prayers or perhaps incantations. In the grey space between waking and dreaming, James found himself speaking of things long buried, the friend he'd failed to save at Shiloh, the civilian family caught in crossfire outside Richmond, the promises broken and beliefs abandoned. In war's crucible, Nayeli listened without interruption, bearing witness to confessions he'd never intended to voice. Dawn found him exhausted but clearer, the fever having broken sometime in the night's darkest hours. Nayeli slept beside him, her hand still resting on his arm, as if to anchor him to the world of the living. The vulnerability of the position struck him deeply. This woman, who had every reason to mistrust him, now sleeping within reach, her guard completely lowered. When she awakened, their eyes met in the soft morning light filtering through pine branches. Something had fundamentally changed between them, the intimacy of suffering witnessed and eased, creating a bond that needed no articulation. "Thank you," James said simply. Nayeli nodded once, acceptance of both his gratitude and what had passed between them during the night's fevered confessions. "We must reach my mother's people soon," she said, her practical tone belied by the lingering concern in her eyes. "They have medicines stronger than what I can find here." James sat up cautiously, testing his strength. The weakness remained, but the consuming heat of infection had receded. "I can ride," he said. "You lead." As they broke camp, Nayeli retrieved Thornton's silver watch from her pocket and pressed it into James's hand. "Carry this," she said. "A reminder." "Of what?" he asked, curling his fingers around the cool metal. "That some debts can be repaid," she answered, "and some burdens shared." The journey into the mountains tested James's endurance to its limits. Though the fever had broken, weakness clung to him like a persistent shadow, turning each step into an exercise of will over failing flesh. Nayeli fashioned a walking stick from a sturdy pine branch, its smooth bark worn to a subtle shine beneath his grip as the hours passed. The landscape grew increasingly vertical, demanding climbs that left James light-headed and breathless. Yet with each painful ascent came reward, vistas of staggering beauty, air so pure it seemed to cleanse more than just lungs, and a growing sense of distance from the world they'd left behind. Nayeli walked beside him when the trail allowed, slightly ahead when it narrowed. Her steps had taken on a new lightness the deeper they penetrated into the mountains, as if proximity to her mother's people restored something essential within her. Occasionally she would pause, touching certain trees or rock formations in ways that suggested recognition of landmarks invisible to James's eye. "There," she said late in the afternoon of their second day in the mountains, pointing toward a high valley nestled between protective peaks. "The summer camp lies beyond that ridge." James squinted against the slanting sunlight. The valley appeared empty from their vantage point, offering no visible signs of human habitation. "You're certain they're there?" Nayeli nodded. "The smoke is controlled, the shelter's hidden, but they are there." She turned to him, her expression serious. "When we approach, you must let me walk ahead alone at first. There will be sentries. They must see me without threat before they see you." James nodded, understanding the wisdom in her caution. "How will I know when to follow?" "I will return for you," she said simply. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, "Remove your gun, carry it wrapped, not worn." "No." The request made tactical sense, but triggered old instincts of self-preservation. James had not been separated from his weapon since the war. The revolver had become more than tool. It was identity, security, the last reliable companion on a lonely path. Nayeli seemed to read his hesitation. "Trust must begin somewhere," she said quietly, looking into her eyes that had watched over him through fever, that had witnessed his darkest confessions without condemnation. James found he could not refuse. Slowly, he unbuckled his gun belt and wrapped the revolver in his spare shirt, securing it with careful precision before stowing it in their pack. They made camp that night beneath a massive old-growth pine whose branches created a natural shelter. Neither spoke much, each absorbed in private thoughts about what the coming day might bring. James sensed Nayeli's growing anticipation, her movements quicker, her gaze repeatedly drawn toward the valley that promised reunion with her mother's people. "Will they welcome you?" he asked as they sat beside their small fire, sharing the last of their provisions. Nayeli considered the question, her expression complex. "I am of their blood, but not fully their kind," she answered finally. "They will accept me, but always as something adjacent." She looked at him directly. "Not unlike how your world has treated me." The parallel struck James with unexpected force. The realization that Nayeli existed perpetually between worlds, belonging fully to neither. He wondered how such constant liminality shaped a soul, whether it created unique strength or singular loneliness, perhaps both. "And me," he asked, "what reception should I expect?" "Suspicion," she replied honestly. "Perhaps hostility at first. Your kind has given them little reason for trust." She added a small branch to their fire, watching sparks ascend into darkness. "But you saved me, fought for me. These things will matter." James nodded, accepting the assessment without illusion. "I've faced worse welcomes." Nayeli smiled faintly. "Yes, I imagine you have." Morning brought clear skies and a crystalline quality to the air that seemed to sharpen every sense. They walked in companionable silence as they approached the ridge that concealed the valley beyond. James's wound had improved significantly under Nayeli's care, though exhaustion still shadowed his movements. At the base of the final ascent, Nayeli paused, turning to James. "Wait here," she instructed. "I will return when it is safe." He nodded, settling onto a sun-warmed boulder. "I'll be here." Something flickered in her expression. Concern, perhaps, or an unspoken question. She reached out suddenly, touching his face with gentle fingers. The gesture was brief, but carried a weight of meaning neither was prepared to articulate. Then she was gone, moving up the trail with the sure-footed grace of one returning to familiar ground. James watched until she disappeared over the ridge, then exhaled slowly, feeling strangely bereft in her absence. The waiting stretched from minutes into an hour, then longer. James fought against encroaching anxiety, reminding himself that diplomatic negotiations required time, especially when complicated by history and justified mistrust. Still, as the sun climbed higher, doubt began to gnaw at his composure. He was considering the wisdom of following Nayeli's path when movement caught his eye, 3 figures descending the trail toward him. Nayeli walked in front, flanked by 2 Apache men whose expressions revealed nothing of their thoughts. All 3 carried bows, arrows nocked but pointed downward, neither threatening nor entirely peaceful. James remained seated, hands resting visibly on his knees, projecting calm despite the thundering of his heart. Nayeli approached first, her face carefully neutral. "They will allow you to enter," she said in English. "The elder wishes to speak with the man who killed Thornton." James stood slowly, mindful of appearing non-threatening. "You told them?" "Truth is the only currency accepted here," she replied simply. The 2 warriors approached, their scrutiny intense and unabashed. The older of the 2 spoke rapidly to Nayeli, who responded in kind. After a brief exchange, she turned to James. "They will guide us. I will translate. Do not make sudden movements." The ascent to the ridge was made in tense silence, broken only by the sound of boots and moccasins against stone. As they crested the summit, the valley beyond revealed itself, a hidden paradise of meadows cradled within protective mountains, a small creek threading silver through its heart. Scattered throughout this natural haven were dwellings, some traditional wickiups, others more permanent structures of stone and timber. People moved about the encampment, women tending fires, children playing, men crafting tools or weapons. All activity slowed as they noticed the approaching party, attention focusing with particular intensity on James. They were led to the largest structure at the camp's center, where an elderly man sat before a small fire, his deeply lined face testifying to decades of sun and survival. Several other tribal elders flanked him, their expressions ranging from open hostility to guarded curiosity. The old man spoke, his voice surprisingly strong despite his apparent age. Nayeli translated, her tone respectful. "He asks why a white soldier would risk his life for an Apache girl." James considered his answer carefully, aware that his words would be judged not just for content, but for the spirit behind them. "I was tired of walking past suffering I could prevent," he said, simply, "and she is worth protecting." The elder listened to Nayeli's translation, his dark eyes revealing nothing. He spoke again, at greater length. "He says you have the look of a man who has seen many deaths," Nayeli translated, "including those of his people." James didn't flinch from the accusation. "I fought against those who would keep others in chains," he replied. "But yes, I have blood on my hands that no river can wash clean." The conversation continued in this manner. Direct questions met with honest answers, cultural barriers navigated through Nayeli's careful translation. James sensed he was being assessed on levels beyond the merely verbal. His posture, his eyes, the spaces between his words, all scrutinized for evidence of his true nature. Finally, after what seemed hours of this gentle interrogation, the elder nodded once and spoke to one of the younger men. Nayeli turned to James, the first hint of a smile touching her lips. "You may stay," she said. "They will help heal your wound properly and offer shelter while you recover your strength." Relief washed through James, followed quickly by gratitude. "Thank them for me," he said. "Tell them I won't forget this kindness." As Nayeli translated, the elder rose with dignity despite his years and approached James. With deliberate movements, he placed his palm against James's chest, directly over his heart, and spoke a single phrase. "He says," Nayeli translated, her voice softening, "that your spirit walks a path of healing and that such journeys are never completed alone." Days in the Apache camp unfolded with a rhythm entirely foreign to James's experience. Time seemed measured not by hours but by the sun's passage, the changing quality of light, the patterns of communal activity that flowed like water finding its natural course. Initially, he remained an outsider, tolerated but held at careful distance, observed with the wary respect accorded to potentially dangerous unknowns. Nayeli moved between worlds with practiced ease, attending to James's wound with medicines provided by the tribal healer, but also resuming her place among her mother's people. He watched as she was gradually reabsorbed into the community's fabric, speaking the language with increasing fluency, assisting with daily tasks, her movements, adopting the unhurried deliberation that characterized the Apache approach to living. James's shoulder healed rapidly under the combined ministrations of Nayeli and the tribal medicine woman, a severe-faced elder whose hands belied her appearance with their gentle deftness. The infection retreated completely, replaced by healthy, new tissue that would eventually form another scar among the many that mapped his body's history. As his strength returned, James found ways to contribute, repairing tools with skills learned during the war, helping construct a small dam to direct creek water toward the camp's gardens, teaching younger men modifications to their bows that increased accuracy at distance, small gestures that gradually transformed wariness into cautious acceptance. One evening, perhaps 2 weeks into their stay, Nayeli approached as James sat outside the small wickiup that had been assigned to him, watching the sunset paint the surrounding peaks with impossibly vivid hues. "The elders have been discussing." "You," she said without preamble, settling beside him on the ground. James raised an eyebrow. "Should I be concerned?" "They believe your spirit is unbalanced," she replied carefully. "Torn between what was and what might be." He couldn't argue with the assessment. Since arriving at the camp, the nightmares had returned with increased intensity, not memories of battle this time, but confused visions where Thornton's dying. Face morphed into those of men James had killed during the war, all asking why he deserved peace when they had none. "They've proposed a ceremony," Nayeli continued, studying his reaction, "a ritual of cleansing and renewal." "What would that involve?" James asked, curiosity mingling with apprehension. Nayeli chose her words with care. "A symbolic death of the old self, a journey through darkness, the possibility of rebirth." She looked at him directly. "It would not be easy. There would be pain, both physical and spiritual. And they would do this for me, a white man. For Nayeli's protector," she corrected gently, "for the man who prevented Thornton from desecrating sacred land." Her fingers found the leather pouch at her neck, a gesture that had become familiar to James, the one who kept faith when he could have taken reward. James gazed toward the mountains, considering. The Apache had no reason to offer him this opportunity for healing. no obligation beyond basic hospitality to a stranger who had done one good thing. That they would extend such a profound invitation spoke to values his own society often claimed, but rarely practiced. "When?" he asked finally. "3 days," Nayeli replied, "when the moon is new and the veil between worlds thins." She hesitated, then added, "I would stand as your guide, if you wish it." The offer touched something deep within James, the recognition that she was offering not just translation, but spiritual companionship through whatever trials the ceremony might entail. "I would be honored," he said simply. The intervening days passed in quiet preparation. James was instructed to fast, to drink only specific teas prepared by the medicine woman, to spend hours in contemplation beside a small altar of stones where he was encouraged to place objects representing what he wished to leave behind. After considerable thought, he placed 3 items: a button from his Union uniform, carried all these years as a talisman, a bullet extracted from his leg after Shiloh, and a sketch of his childhood home he'd drawn during the war's darkest days. Each represented a tether to his past: duty, pain, longing. Each had shaped him, but perhaps each had also limited what he might become. On the appointed evening, as darkness descended upon the valley, James was led to a clearing beyond the main camp. A large fire burned at its center, surrounded by elders seated in a precise formation. Other tribal members gathered in concentric circles beyond, their faces solemn in the flickering light. Nayeli waited for him at the edge of the clearing, dressed in ceremonial garments of dressed deer skin, adorned with intricate beadwork. Her hair had been specially arranged, decorated with feathers and small silver ornaments that caught the firelight. James had never seen her look so fully herself, a woman embracing her heritage without apology or compromise. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly as he approached. James nodded. "Yes." What followed would forever exist in James's memory. As a series of vivid fragments rather than a coherent narrative, the bitter taste of a ceremonial drink that blurred the boundaries between reality and vision. The rhythmic pounding of drums that seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat. The sensation of hands painting symbols on his skin with pigments whose scent triggered primal recognition. Throughout the experience, Nayeli remained a constant presence, sometimes physically supporting him, sometimes translating the elders' instructions, sometimes simply bearing witness to his journey with unwavering attention. The most challenging moment came when he was led to a small, dome-shaped structure covered with hides, a sweat lodge where steam rose from water poured over heated stones. Inside, in absolute darkness, James faced the accumulated ghosts of his past. Each painful memory, each regret, each act of violence committed or witnessed seemed to materialize in the steam-laden air, demanding acknowledgement. "Do not turn. Away," Nayeli's voice instructed from somewhere in the darkness. "See them, know them, release them." Hours passed in that enclosed space, or perhaps it was minutes stretched by intensity into seeming eternity. James lost all sense of time as he confronted each spectre of his former self, each version of the man he had been. He spoke to them, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in raw, broken confessions that tore from his throat like physical pain. When he finally emerged, crawling on hands and knees through the lodge's low entrance, the night air struck his superheated skin like a benediction. Stars wheeled overhead in impossible clarity, each one distinct and purposeful. James felt scoured, emptied, not healed exactly, but cleared of accumulated poison that had prevented healing from beginning. The ceremony's final phase took place. As dawn approached, James knelt before the council of elders as the oldest among them spoke words that Nayeli translated in a voice thick with emotion. "The man who came here no longer exists," she said. "He died in darkness and truth, From his ashes rises Halcon Peregrino, wandering hawk, who sees clearly, who knows both worlds, who carries wisdom earned through suffering. The elder presented, James with a necklace, a single hawk feather suspended on a leather cord alongside a small piece of polished turquoise. As James bowed his head to receive this gift, he felt a profound shift within himself. Not a dramatic transformation, but the quiet rearrangement of possibility, like a river finding a new channel through receptive earth. The ceremony concluded as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern peaks. The tribal members dispersed gradually, returning to daily life with the practical focus that characterized their culture. Only Nayeli remained beside James as he sat watching the new day illuminate the valley. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse from hours of emotional exertion. Nayeli's hand found his, fingers intertwining with natural ease. "Now," she said softly, "you begin." The days following the ceremony brought subtle yet profound changes. James, now known among the Apache as Halcon Peregrino, found himself experiencing the world with heightened awareness, as if layers of protective numbness had been peeled away during his symbolic death and rebirth. Colors seemed more vivid, scents more distinct, sounds more nuanced in their meaning. More significant than these sensory shifts was the gradual quieting of the restlessness that had driven him since the war. The compulsion to keep moving, to remain nowhere long enough, for roots to form, had diminished, not vanished entirely, but transformed into something less desperate, more purposeful. His relationship with the community evolved as well. Where before he had been tolerated as Nayeli's protector, now he was cautiously integrated into daily life. He learned to hunt using Apache methods that emphasized patience and respect for the taken animal. He absorbed their language phrase by phrase, his tongue gradually adapting to its rhythms and tonal subtleties. He listened to stories told by elders around evening fires, tales that explained the world through metaphor and ancestral wisdom. Through it all, Nayeli remained his primary connection, his interpreter of both words and cultural nuances. Their bond deepened with each shared experience, though neither spoke directly of what might lie beyond their present circumstance. Some truths, James was learning, required no articulation to be understood. One crisp morning, as frost etched delicate patterns on fallen leaves throughout the valley, Nayeli found James practicing with a bow near the creek that bordered the eastern edge of the encampment. His marksmanship had improved steadily, though he doubted he would ever match the fluid accuracy of the Apache hunters. "The council has called for you," she said, watching as he loosed an arrow that struck impressively close to his intended target. "They have made a decision about the map." James lowered the bow, something tightening in his chest at her words. The map that had precipitated their entire journey together had been presented to the tribal elders shortly after their arrival. James had deliberately avoided asking about their deliberations, respecting the gravity of their responsibility to protect both the physical land and its spiritual significance. "When?" he asked simply. "Now," Nayeli replied. "They await us in the council lodge." They walked together through the camp, passing women grinding corn with stone metates, children engaged in games that developed skills they would need as adults, men crafting arrows or repairing winter shelters. James noted how many now nodded, in greeting as he passed, small gestures of acceptance that held greater value than any formal declaration. The council lodge stood near the camp's center, its construction more substantial than the surrounding dwellings. Inside, 5 elders sat in a semicircle around a small fire, their faces composed in the dignified expressions that James had come to recognize as their public countenance. He and Nayeli took places across from them, sitting cross-legged on woven mats placed for their use. After the formal greetings had been exchanged, the eldest spoke at length, his voice carrying the measured cadence of considered judgment. Nayeli translated, her own expression carefully neutral. "The council has deliberated on the matter of the silver map," she said. "They believe that what lies beneath the sacred mountain should remain undisturbed. The healing waters that flow from its heart have sustained our people through countless generations. To allow the mining company access would destroy not just land, but spirit," the elder continued, gesturing toward James with weathered hands. "However," Nayeli translated, "they recognize that without proof of the map's destruction, Thornton's employers may send others to search for it, and for you both." She paused, seeming to choose her next words with particular care. "They propose a journey to the territorial governor, with whom they have maintained uneasy peace. A formal declaration that the land in question belongs to the Apache Nation by ancestral right, protected by treaties already signed, if not honored." James understood immediately the significance of what was being suggested. Such a journey would be dangerous, not just physically, but politically. It would require navigating white society's legal structures, confronting its prejudices, standing firm against its entrenched interests. "They ask if Halcon Peregrino would accompany their delegation," Nayeli continued, her eyes meeting his directly. "They believe a white man who walks between worlds might help their words find receptive ears." The request represented extraordinary trust, not just in James's intentions, but in his capacity to represent their interests faithfully in a world that had repeatedly betrayed them. The responsibility of it settled on his shoulders with tangible weight. "It would be an honor," he said without hesitation, "though I cannot promise success, only honest effort." After Nayeli translated his response, the eldest of the council rose and approached James. With solemn dignity, he extended both hands, palms upward in offering. Upon them rested Nayeli's leather pouch, now augmented with additional beadwork, and small feathers that marked its sacred significance. "The map travels with its protectors," Nayeli translated as James carefully accepted the pouch. "But now it carries the prayers and protection of the people. What was one person's burden becomes many strength." The gesture's symbolism was not lost on James. He was being entrusted not just with a document, but with a people's future, their sacred connection to land that defined their existence. That they would place such trust in him, a man whose people had broken countless promises to native tribes across the continent, humbled him beyond words. As they left the council lodge, James felt the weight of the pouch against his chest, where he now wore it, the leather cord joining the one that held his ceremonial feather and turquoise. Nayeli walked beside him in companionable silence, allowing him space to absorb the significance of what had just transpired. "When do we leave?" he asked finally, as they reached the creek's edge, watching sunlight dance across its surface in diamond patterns. "With the new moon," she replied. 6 days hence." James nodded, his thoughts already turning to the journey ahead, the challenges it would present, the opposition they would inevitably face, the delicate negotiations required to secure protection for land valued differently by those who would exploit it versus those who revered it. "You don't have to come," Nayeli said suddenly, breaking into his contemplation. "This journey may place you between your world and mine in ways that force painful choices." James turned to face her fully, struck anew by the strength evident in her features, the wisdom in eyes that had witnessed both beauty and brutality, yet remained unclouded by bitterness. "My world is where I stand," he said simply. "Right now, that's here, with you." Something shifted in Nayeli's expression, a softening, a surrendering of some final reservation. She reached out, her fingers gently touching the hawk feather that hung at his throat. Halcon Peregrino, she murmured, using his ceremonial name with an inflection that transformed it into something more intimate than formal address. The wanderer who found his true direction. As morning light illuminated her face, James recognized the emotion that had been growing between them. Tentative at first, then increasingly certain with each shared hardship, each moment of understanding, each small act of trust. What had begun as reluctant alliance had transformed into something neither had dared name until now, its reality no less powerful for remaining unspoken. With the gentleness one might use to approach a wild creature, James reached out to touch her cheek. Nayeli leaned into the contact, her eyes closing briefly as if to better absorb the sensation. No words passed between them in that moment. None were necessary. The language of their connection had evolved beyond speech into something more fundamental, a recognition of kindred spirits, finding unexpected harbor in each other's presence. The territorial governor's mansion in Santa Fe presented a stark contrast to the natural harmony of the Apache encampment. Its adobe walls had been whitewashed to mimic Eastern architectural conventions, its garden laid out in rigid geometric patterns that imposed order rather than embracing organic form. To James, returning to white society after months in the mountains felt like stepping into a world rendered in harsher lines, sharper angles, more definitive boundaries. Their party consisted of 5: James, Nayeli, 2 tribal elders, and a younger warrior who had fought against Mexican forces and understood their language, providing an additional bridge of communication if needed. They had traveled for 10 days, avoiding main roads and settlements where possible, camping beneath stars that seemed to dim as they approached civilization's glow. Now they waited in an anteroom, having secured this audience through a complex network of interpreters, intermediaries, and the invocation of treaty obligations, rarely honored but still technically binding. James wore clean clothes provided by a sympathetic missionary at the territory's edge, though he had refused to remove the hawk feather and turquoise that marked his spiritual transformation. Nayeli sat beside him, dressed in a careful compromise. Between Apache tradition and Western expectations, enough conformity to avoid immediate dismissal, enough cultural markers to maintain her identity. "They will try to separate us," James murmured, noting how officials had already attempted to direct him to different quarters upon their arrival. "Stay close." Nayeli nodded almost imperceptibly, her composure unshaken despite the hostile curiosity, evident in the glances directed their way by the governor's staff. The journey had further cemented what had begun by the creek, a partnership now inseparable from deeper emotion, expressed more through actions than declarations. When they were finally ushered into the governor's office, James assessed the man behind the imposing desk with the practiced eye of one who had evaluated countless superiors during wartime. Governor Ashton Maxwell projected the practiced affability of a career politician, handsome in a conventional way, impeccably groomed, his smile stopping precisely at the boundary of his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood," the governor greeted him with pointedly exclusive focus. "Quite the journey you've had, according to the reports. The territorial authorities had assumed you perished alongside Thornton and his men." "Reports of my death were premature," James replied evenly, "as were assumptions about my allegiances." Maxwell's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Indeed. And now you appear before me in—" he gestured vaguely toward James's necklace— "interesting company, with an equally interesting proposition." James inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the governor's characterization without endorsing it. "We come regarding lands protected under the Treaty of Horse Creek," he said, deliberately using "we" to establish his position. "Specifically, the western slopes of what your maps call the Black Mesa Range." The meeting proceeded with the delicate maneuvering typical of negotiations where true intentions remained partially veiled. Governor Maxwell clearly recognized the potential value in what the Apache delegation sought to protect. His questions repeatedly circled around the specific locations mentioned in Nayeli's map, though he never directly addressed the possibility of silver deposits. Throughout the discussion, James observed how skillfully Nayeli translated not just words, but intentions, softening potential provocations, emphasizing points of agreement, building linguistic bridges between fundamentally different worldviews. Her intelligence and diplomacy impressed him anew with each exchange. The territorial government recognizes its treaty obligations, Maxwell finally stated after nearly 2 hours of careful discussion, though the specific boundaries mentioned remain subject to interpretation. He straightened papers on his desk with manicured hands. I will need to consult with territorial surveyors and appropriate federal representatives before rendering any final determination. James recognized the statement for what it was, neither commitment nor rejection, but the politician's art of preserving options while appearing reasonable. He exchanged glances with the tribal elders, receiving their slight nods of understanding. The Apache Nation appreciates your consideration, James replied formally. We will await your determination with interest. Nay, he placed deliberate emphasis on the word await, a subtle reminder that patience measured in generations was a resource his companions possessed in abundance. As they prepared to depart, Governor Maxwell addressed James directly, his voice lowered though not enough to prevent Nayeli from hearing. A word of advice, Blackwood. Your association with these people may seem novel now, even meaningful, but a man of your background, your potential, would find greater opportunity returning to your own kind. James studied the governor's face. Its absolute certainty, its unquestioned assumption of superiority, its inability to conceive of choices beyond those dictated by society's expectations. I have returned to my kind, Governor, he replied, quietly. Those who value truth above convenience, courage above conformity, and the sacred above the profitable. Outside, in the mansion's courtyard, James found himself breathing deeply, as if to clear his lungs of the stifling atmosphere they had endured. The tribal elders conferred quietly, their expressions revealing nothing of their thoughts to untrained observers. What happens now? Nayeli asked, standing close beside him as they gazed toward distant mountains visible beyond the town's boundaries. We wait, James replied. The governor will investigate, discover that the Western mining company's claim to those lands has no legal foundation, particularly with Thornton deceased and unable to produce documentation. And if he decides against the tribe, she pressed, ever practical. James touched the leather pouch that still hung at his throat alongside his ceremonial necklace. Then we have other paths. The map exists only in our keeping now. Without it, they would spend years searching fruitlessly. Nayeli's hand found his, fingers intertwining with practiced familiarity. And us? She asked, the question encompassing far more than their immediate plans. James turned to face her fully, no longer concerned with who might witness this moment of vulnerability. In her eyes, he saw reflected the journey that had brought them to this point, from captor and captive to allies, from allies to friends, from friends to something deeper that transcended conventional definition. I go where you go, he said. Simply, if you return to your mother's people, I'll be beside you. If you wish to travel beyond these territories, I'll walk that path too. He reached up to touch the hawk feather at his throat. The wanderer has found his true north. Nayeli's smile held both joy and knowing sadness. Both of us have lived between worlds, she said softly. Perhaps our place is not in either, but in the spaces between, building bridges rather than choosing sides. The wisdom in her words struck James with their profound truth. They were, both of them, forever changed by their experiences, no longer fully belonging to their original worlds, yet carrying essential elements of those worlds within them. Their strength lay not in rejecting this complexity, but in embracing it, using their unique perspectives to create understanding where division had prevailed. As the sun began its western descent, casting long shadows across Santa Fe's adobe buildings and dusty streets, James and Nayeli walked together toward the modest lodgings where their party had taken rooms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new battles perhaps. But for this moment, walking side by side with the woman who had helped him rediscover his humanity, James felt a peace that had eluded him since before the war. That evening, as twilight softened the harsh edges of the territorial capital, they stood together on a small balcony overlooking gardens where desert plants had been arranged in unnatural precision. In the distance, mountains rose in silhouette against a sky painted in impossible hues of purple and gold. "I have something for you," James said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small object. Nayeli looked curious as he placed it in her palm, a small wooden carving of a hawk in flight, its wings extended in perfect balance. During their journey, he had worked on it in quiet moments, using a pocket knife and skills learned from watching the Apache craftsman. "It's beautiful," she said, turning it to catch the fading light. "A promise," James explained, suddenly self-conscious despite all they had shared. "That whatever comes, whatever path we walk it together, free, by choice, bound by something stronger than circumstance." Nayeli closed her fingers around the carving, then reached up to touch his face with her free hand. "I accepted that promise long ago," she said softly. "When you first cut my bonds, instead of claiming ownership." As the day's final light gilded her features, James recognized the completion of a circle that had begun in a dusty cantina in Silver Creek. What had started as an impulsive act of redemption had transformed them both, creating possibility where once there had been only survival. The journey ahead remained uncertain, the challenges substantial. The world would not easily accept their partnership, their choices, their defiance of conventional boundaries. But standing together as darkness gathered and stars emerged to reclaim the sky, James and Nayeli faced that uncertainty with the quiet strength of those who had already survived their darkest moments and emerged transformed. Not as savior and saved, not as protector and protected, but as equals who had found in each other the courage to become their truest selves, spirits of the desert wind, untamed and free.